My name is Margaret Chin, and I'm 63 years old. I spent my entire life playing by the rules, saving every penny, and believing that family was the only investment that would truly matter. I was so wrong. Let me take you back to a moment that changed everything. To the day I walked into my son's office for what I thought would be a celebration. And instead, I was met with words I'll never forget. I stood outside the glass doors of TechFlow Solutions, watching my son, David, through the window. He was laughing with his business partner, Vesper. At that moment, I didn't know that everything I'd sacrificed for, everything I'd given, was about to blow up in my face. I opened the door, proud, excited, thinking I was walking into a meeting where I'd be acknowledged. Instead, I walked into humiliation. David's face changed the moment he saw me. Not in a good way. Vesper smirked, actually smirked, like I was interrupting something important. And then David said the words that haunt me even now. "Mom, you're an anonymous investor. That's what we agreed. Keep your mouth shut. You're not sophisticated enough for board meetings. You don't understand how real business works." I stood there in my modest cardigan and simple slacks, holding a folder with quarterly reports I'd asked to review. And my own son looked at me like I was an embarrassment. But I need to tell you how we got here. Because understanding the beginning is the only way you'll understand why what happened next was so necessary. I was born in 1962 to immigrant parents who arrived in this country with literally nothing. My father worked as a mechanic, my mother cleaned houses. I was their only child, and every sacrifice they made was for me. They worked 12-hour days so I could have piano lessons, so I could go to college, so I could become more than they could dream of becoming. I became an accountant. Not because I wanted to be rich. I became an accountant because I understood numbers, because I understood that money was a language of safety and stability. My parents didn't have that language, and they struggled their entire lives because of it. I promised myself I would be different. I worked at a major accounting firm for 40 years. 40 years. I was respected, reliable, and I was good at my job. I never made enormous amounts of money. I wasn't one of the partners. I was a solid, dependable employee who made decent money and saved every single penny. My colleagues would go on vacations. I bought index funds. They bought cars. I drove a 12-year-old Honda. They went out to restaurants. I cooked at home. I did this intentionally. Because I wanted something more than material comfort. I wanted freedom. I wanted to one day be able to do things on my own terms. My husband, Robert, was a teacher. We loved each other deeply, but we never had a lot of money. That was fine with us. We had a modest house, a good life, and by the time I turned 50, we had saved over $1 million. When Robert passed away at 58 from a sudden heart attack, I was devastated but also secure. His life insurance, combined with our savings, left me with approximately $2.3 million. I was a widow. For the first time in my life, I had genuine wealth, and I had no one to share it with except my son and his family. David was 35 at the time. He was bright, genuinely intelligent. He'd graduated from Stanford with a computer science degree, and had always talked about wanting to start his own company. He was tired of working for other people, tired of seeing mediocre ideas get funded while his brilliance was passed over. I understood that hunger. It reminded me of my younger self. When David came to me 3 years ago and told me about his business idea, I listened carefully. He and his business partner, Vesper Grant, wanted to start a software company focused on AI-driven supply chain optimization. It was a solid idea. The market was there. They had a prototype, and they were intelligent about the business plan. David said they needed investors, and he asked me directly, "Mom, would you be willing to invest in my company? This could be huge." I didn't hesitate. My son was asking me to believe in him, to put my money where my mouth was about supporting his dreams. I told him I would invest $2 million. That was my life savings. Literally every penny I had accumulated through 40 years of careful work and sacrifice. David hugged me and cried. He told me I was the best mother in the world, that he would make this worth my while, that I would be so proud of what he was building. I was so proud. I was so hopeful. The company was structured as follows. David and Vesper each held 20% equity. I, as the primary investor, held 60%. On paper, I was the majority shareholder. On paper, this was a smart, protected investment. But there's a difference between what's on paper and what actually happens in a business. From the very beginning, David and Vesper started freezing me out. My emails asking for quarterly reports were ignored. When I asked to attend board meetings, David told me it would be too awkward, and that he'd brief me separately. Those separate briefings never happened. I tried to tell myself this was normal. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was too old-fashioned, too risk-averse, too anti-esque for the startup world. I had spent 40 years in a structured corporate environment. Maybe I didn't understand the new rules of business. So I waited. I trusted. That was my first mistake. For 2 years, I watched from the sidelines. And during those 2 years, I learned something that every parent eventually learns. Your children are not extensions of yourself. They are separate people, with their own ambitions, their own moral compasses, and sometimes their own capacity for betrayal. I began to notice things. David and I would have lunch, rare occasions where he'd actually make time for me, and he'd mention expenses casually. A trip to Bali for research. A new office space in a premium building. Salaries that seemed incredibly generous for a company that was supposedly in its growth phase and still burning money. I asked about these things. I asked gently, not wanting to be the overbearing mother, not wanting to be the paranoid investor. David would brush me off. Trust me, Mom. These are necessary business expenses. You wouldn't understand how competitive the tech scene is. Those words started to chip away at me. You wouldn't understand. I'm an accountant. Numbers are literally my language. But my own son was treating me like I was intellectually beneath him. Vesper was worse. She made it clear, painfully, intentionally clear, that she saw me as an obstacle. At one company dinner I was finally invited to, Vesper made a point of discussing complex financial modeling with David, speaking so quickly and using such specialized jargon that I literally couldn't follow the conversation. When I asked a clarifying question, she looked at me like I'd spoken in tongues. Not really relevant to what we're discussing, she said coolly, and turned back to David. I sat there, my hands trembling slightly, humiliated in front of people who worked for a company I owned. By year 2.5, I hadn't received a single dividend. I hadn't been sent a detailed financial report in 18 months. The separate briefings David promised never materialized. When I'd ask about the company's progress, I'd get vague responses. It's going great, Mom. Don't worry about it, Mom. You'll see returns eventually, Mom. Eventually. That's not how majority shareholders are treated. That's how people treat someone they think is too foolish to notice they're being excluded. I'm ashamed to say that I started doubting myself. I was 61 years old. I had worked my entire adult life, but suddenly I felt stupid. I felt old. I felt like maybe, just maybe, my son and his partner were right. Maybe I didn't belong in their world. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to ask anymore. I was going to do something I should have done from the beginning. I was going to audit. 3 months before the confrontation I mentioned at the beginning, I contacted a forensic accountant friend of mine, Daniel Torres. Daniel and I had worked together for 15 years before he'd gone independent. I explained the situation to him carefully. No embellishment, just the facts. My investment, the lack of transparency, the growing distance. Margaret, he said, as majority shareholder, you have every legal right to audit those books. More than a right, it's your responsibility. I don't want to betray my son's trust, I said, and I meant it. Margaret, Daniel said firmly, your son has already betrayed your trust. Not because of what he's done, because of what he's hidden. He was right. Daniel spent 6 weeks going through TechFlow's financial records. I gave him access by claiming I wanted an official review done for my personal records. David didn't even push back. He sent the files over within hours, probably assuming I'd be so confused by the spreadsheets that I'd give up. What Daniel found made my blood run cold. In 6 months alone, Vesper had transferred over $800,000 to her personal company, Grant Consulting Services. That company didn't appear to exist for any legitimate business purpose. It was a shell. The money was being funneled directly into her bank account. David had authorized 3 of the transfers. The others, Vesper had signed off on herself, using authority she absolutely did not have. There were other discrepancies too. Inflated contractor bills, payments to vendors that didn't exist, equipment purchases that were never delivered. In total, they had embezzled approximately $1.4 million of the company's funds in just 18 months. My money. The investment was supposed to fund operations and growth. Instead, they were stealing it. When Daniel presented these findings to me, I sat in his office for a long time without speaking. I kept thinking about my father, working 18 hours a day in a mechanic shop, his hands permanently stained with grease. I thought about my mother on her knees scrubbing other people's bathrooms, so I could have opportunities. I thought about Robert, my husband, who'd spent his life shaping young minds for a teacher's salary, never complaining. I thought about my own 40 years of discipline, of saying no to myself over and over, of choosing stability over pleasure. And I thought about my son, who had been given every advantage, every opportunity, every chance to build something meaningful. And he'd chosen to steal from me. From me. Daniel looked at me carefully. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I had options. I could take this to the police. I could sue David personally. I could dissolve the company entirely and recover what I could. But I chose something different. I chose to teach him a lesson he would never forget. "I want to call a board meeting," I said. "I want to exercise my majority shareholder rights. And I want him to realize, in front of his partner, in front of whatever witnesses we can gather, that he made a fatal mistake the moment he decided his mother was too unsophisticated to understand what he was doing." Daniel smiled. It was the kind of smile that said he understood exactly why I was his favorite former colleague. "Margaret," he said, "let's make this official." Planning the board meeting took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of strategic silence, of acting completely normal around David while knowing exactly what he'd been doing. That was harder than I expected. David called me on a Thursday evening, asking if I wanted to come over for dinner. I said yes. We sat at his dining table, the one he'd bought with company money, I now knew, and I watched him talk about his day, about Vesper's ideas for the next product launch, about how close they were to profitability. Lies. Casual, confident lies. I smiled and nodded and asked follow-up questions like a proud mother. Inside, I was documenting every word, every false promise, every deflection. This is what hurt the most. It wasn't just the money. It was the casualness of the betrayal. The fact that he could sit across from me and fabricate an entire reality without even blinking. Daniel and I prepared meticulously. We created a formal audit report, complete with documentation, transaction histories, and forensic analysis. We prepared a spreadsheet that showed, in absolute clarity, exactly where every dollar had gone. We gathered copies of bank transfers, vendor invoices, and shell company registrations. We also prepared something else. A detailed breakdown of what charges could be brought, what prison sentences were possible, and what civil liability both David and Vesper would face. I wanted them to understand the gravity of what they'd done. On a Monday morning, I called David's office. His assistant told me he was in a meeting. I told her to interrupt him and tell him his mother needed to speak with him urgently. He picked up 30 seconds later, his voice tight with concern. "Mom, are you okay? Are you sick?" "I'm fine," I said calmly. "I'm calling to inform you that I'm scheduling an emergency board meeting for this Friday at 2 p.m. I'm exercising my majority shareholder rights to conduct a full audit review. I'll need you, Vesper, and any other board members or key staff present. I'm also bringing a forensic accountant." There was silence on the line. "Mom, what is this about?" His voice had changed. It was no longer concerned. It was scared. "Friday at 2 p.m. I repeated. "Conference room. Be there." I hung up. He called back 4 times. I didn't answer. He texted. I didn't respond. By Wednesday, he was calling Daniel directly, demanding to know what was happening. Daniel, professionally and calmly, told him that the audit was proceeding as scheduled, and that all would be explained in the meeting. Vesper called me on Thursday. That conversation was memorable. "Margaret," she said, using my first name in that dismissive way she always did. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is inappropriate." David and I have built this company together. You're an investor. You're not a board member. You don't have the authority to. I'm the majority shareholder, I said quietly. I have 60% equity. I have every authority. Goodbye, Vesper. I could hear her sputtering as I ended the call. Friday arrived. I dressed carefully that morning. I wore a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white blouse. I wore my pearl earrings, the ones Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary. I wanted to look professional but also like the woman I actually was, a retired accountant who had spent 40 years understanding how money moves and how people lie. When I walked into TechFlow's conference room at 1:55 p.m., David was already there, along with Vesper. 2 other employees I'd never seen before sat near the door. Daniel sat at the far end of the table with his briefcase. David's face was pale. Vesper looked angry, like she was barely containing her fury. I sat down at the head of the table. Thank you all for being here. I began, and my voice was absolutely steady. As the majority shareholder of TechFlow Solutions, I have called this emergency board meeting to address serious financial irregularities that have been discovered during an audit of the company's records. Mom, this is completely inappropriate, David started to say, but I held up my hand. Let me finish. And for the first time in 3 years, everyone in that room listened to me without interrupting. Daniel stood and distributed printed copies of his audit report. I watched their faces as they began to scan the pages. David's went from pale to a shade of green the first didn't know was possible. Vesper stood up, her hands shaking. This is insane, she said. These accusations are not accusations, I said. Facts. Documented, verified facts. Daniel, would you walk us through the findings? Daniel spent the next 30 minutes presenting the evidence. He showed the shell company registrations. He showed the bank transfers. He showed the fraudulent vendor invoices. He showed how Vesper had systematically funneled company funds into her personal accounts, and how David had authorized much of it. Based on my analysis, Daniel concluded, the company has lost approximately $1.4 million in fraudulent transfers and embezzled funds over an 18-month period. Depending on how the company wishes to proceed, this could be reported to federal law enforcement, resulting in charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and theft. The conference room was silent. Then Vesper stood up. You know what? This is a witch hunt. I'm leaving. Sit down, I said. She actually sat down. Maybe it was the tone in my voice. Or maybe it was the realization that I wasn't the confused, out-of-touch mother she'd been dismissing for 3 years. As majority shareholder, I am exercising my authority to immediately terminate both your employment and your position with the company, effective immediately. Security is waiting downstairs to escort you from the building and to retrieve all company property, passwords, and devices. I pressed a button on my phone. I'd prepared this carefully, and 2 security guards appeared at the conference room door. Vesper stood to leave, her face absolutely crimson with rage. Before you go, I said, you should know that I've instructed Daniel to file a civil suit against you personally for the $1.4 million you stole. I've also turned over all documentation to federal authorities. You'll be hearing from the FBI within the week. She left without another word. Now it was just David and me. He was crying. Actual tears were streaming down his face, and his hands were shaking as he looked at the audit report in front of him. David, I said, and my voice softened because he was still my son. Even if my son had betrayed me, do you understand what you've done? He couldn't speak. He just shook his head. You didn't just steal from an investor, I continued. You stole from your mother. You stole from the woman who gave up 40 years of her life to build something secure, something I could give back to this world, something I could give to you. David looked up at me, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Genuine remorse. Not fear of consequences, but actual remorse. Mom, I didn't mean to. He started, but stopped. Because what was he going to say? That he didn't mean to steal from me? That he didn't mean to lie to my face dozens of times? That he didn't mean to let Vesper convince him that I was beneath him? That I was a liability to his business? I know you didn't mean to, I said, and I meant it. That's what makes it worse. You didn't mean to betray me. You just did it anyway, without thinking about the consequences. Without thinking about me at all. I was under so much pressure, David said, his voice desperate. Vesper kept saying we needed more capital, that we needed to move faster, that the market wouldn't wait. I thought if I could just get through the next phase, if the company succeeded, then it would all be worth it. I'd pay you back. I'd make it right. With what money? I asked. David, listen to yourself. You were planning to make your theft, right, with profits you were generating by continuing to steal. That's not a plan. That's a fantasy you told yourself so you could sleep at night. He put his head in his hands. What happens now? He asked quietly. That was a good question. Now, I said, you're going to face the consequences. Real consequences. The federal authorities have the documentation. They will decide whether to prosecute. If they do, you'll face charges. You may face prison time. You'll certainly face financial liability. Mom, please, he started. Don't, I said. Don't ask me to make this go away. I could hire lawyers. I could negotiate. I could be your mother and protect you from the consequences of what you've done. I paused. But that's exactly what got us here. I've spent my entire life protecting you. From the moment you were born, I've put your needs first. I missed opportunities because of you. I made choices because of you. And I'm not angry about that. That's what mothers do. We sacrifice. I could feel tears forming, but I didn't let them fall. But somewhere along the way, you learned that my sacrifice meant you didn't have to respect me. You learned that you could take what I gave you and treat it like it was owed to you. You learned that lying to me was acceptable because you decided I wasn't sophisticated enough to understand the truth. David was crying harder now. I'm going to recover what I can of my investment, I continued. The company will be restructured. I'm removing you and Vesper from any decision-making authority. I'm bringing in professional management, people who actually know how to run a business ethically. If the company succeeds under new leadership, profits will go toward restitution. Your restitution, both to me and potentially to the federal government, depending on how they handle this. What about me? David asked. What happens to me? You find out who you are without Vesper. You find out if you have the integrity you claim to have. And you understand, finally, that your mother, your unsophisticated, out-of-touch mother, was the one thing standing between you and complete ruin. There was nothing left to say. I stood, gathered my papers, and looked at my son sitting at that conference table with his head in his hands. I felt sadness and anger in equal measure. I felt disappointment and, surprisingly, compassion. Because David was right about one thing. He was under pressure. Vesper had manipulated him, encouraged him, made the theft feel necessary and justified. But that didn't absolve him of responsibility. It just made it more complicated. I walked toward the door, and David called after me. Mom, wait. I turned around. I'm sorry, he said. I am genuinely sorry. Not because I got caught, but because I let you down. Because I made you feel small. Because I didn't trust you when you've done nothing but earn my trust. I nodded. I know you are. That matters. But it doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change what you did or what I have to do now. Will you ever forgive me? He asked. I thought about that carefully. Forgiveness was something I'd been taught to give freely, something my parents had modeled for me despite everything they suffered. It was a beautiful instinct, but also, I was learning, a dangerous one if it meant absolving people of consequences. Yes, I said finally. I will forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't mean going back to the way things were. Forgiveness means I release the anger I'm holding on to, not for you, but for myself. Because holding on to rage will poison me, and I've already sacrificed enough. I walked out of that conference room, and Daniel followed me. As we waited for the elevator, he put a hand on my shoulder. How are you feeling? He asked. Tired, I said. Sat. But also lighter somehow. The elevator doors opened. What will you do now? Daniel asked. I stepped inside. I'm going to rebuild the company properly. I'm going to hire a CEO who knows what they're doing. And I'm going to learn something I should have learned a long time ago. What's that? That loving someone doesn't mean letting them walk all over you. That protecting yourself isn't selfish. That saying no to people you love is sometimes the most loving thing you can do. The elevator doors closed, and I watched the floors descend. TechFlow Solutions became profitable within 18 months under professional management. A new CEO, brought in from the outside, restructured the company's operations and rebuilt trust with investors. David, humbled and sober, found work as a mid-level software engineer at another company. It wasn't the founder's position he'd dreamed of, but it was honest work. He paid back $340,000 of the embezzled funds through a settlement agreement. The federal authorities decided not to prosecute in exchange for restitution and cooperation. It was more lenient than he deserved, but I didn't fight it. I had recovered what I needed to recover, not just my money, but my dignity. Vesper was less fortunate. She was prosecuted on wire fraud charges and served 3 years in federal prison. The investigation revealed that this wasn't her first time committing financial crimes. She had a history of this behavior, using charming young men as proxies for her schemes. I visited David 2 months after the board meeting. We met at a coffee shop near his new apartment. A modest place, nothing like the luxury he'd been enjoying on stolen money. He looked different. Smaller somehow. Or maybe I just saw him clearly for the first time. "Thank you for meeting with me," he said. "You're my son," I replied. "I'll always meet with you. But I need you to understand something. Our relationship has changed. It will be different now. We have to rebuild it based on honesty, not on obligation." "I understand," he said. "Do you?" I asked. "Because I need you to know that there's no shortcut back to where we were. No gesture, no apology, no grand reconciliation. We rebuild slowly, day by day, with you proving through your actions that you've learned something from this." He nodded, and I could see he meant it. The first year after the board meeting was the hardest. Not because of the legal battles or the financial restructuring, though those were challenging. The hardest part was learning to navigate a relationship with my son that was built on something other than unconditional maternal protection. I'd spent 35 years being David's mother in a particular way, sacrificing, supporting, believing in him without question. And while those are beautiful things, I realized they created a dynamic where David never had to truly respect me. Respect and unconditional love are different things. I was learning that I needed both from my child, not just his love. The company's turnaround was remarkable though. Within the first 6 months under new leadership, TechFlow Solutions secured a Series B funding round worth $8 million from legitimate venture capital firms. The new CEO, Patricia Wong, was brilliant, a former Google executive who had the experience David and Vesper clearly lacked. Patricia called me into her office one afternoon, about 8 months into her tenure. Her office was on the top floor, overlooking the city skyline. "Margaret," she said, sitting across from me, "I wanted to brief you on where we stand with the company. As majority shareholder, you have a right to understand our strategic direction." This is what legitimate business partnership looks like, I thought. Clear communication, respect, honesty. "I appreciate that," I said. "Your investment has been crucial to our survival," Patricia continued. "When I came on board, this company was in shambles. The culture was toxic, the finances were a disaster, and the product itself was actually quite good, but buried under layers of corruption and mismanagement." She pulled up a financial projection on her screen. "Based on our current trajectory, we project profitability within 18 months. At that point, your initial investment should be worth approximately $4.8 million, with annual dividend projections of $600,000 to $800,000 ongoing." I looked at the numbers. My $2 million investment, the one I'd agonized over, the one that had nearly destroyed my family, it was actually going to return my money with interest. It was going to continue generating income. "Patricia," I said carefully, "do you know the full history of what happened here before you arrived?" "I know some of it," she said. "David mentioned embezzlement by Vesper. He mentioned that you'd discovered financial irregularities. I know there were consequences." "Let me tell you what actually happened," I said. And I did. I told her about the theft, about the manipulation, about the humiliation, about the confrontation. I told her about my son's betrayal and my decision to hold him accountable despite the emotional cost. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Margaret, you're one of the most courageous investors I've ever worked with. Most people in your situation would have either let their son destroy the company completely, or they would have protected him at all costs. You did neither. You chose to protect the company and ultimately, to protect your son from himself." "I'm not sure that's what I was doing," I said honestly. "I think I was mostly protecting myself. Protecting my dignity. My legacy." "That's not less noble," Patricia said. "Actually, it might be more. You didn't do this from a place of parental guilt or obligation. You did it from a place of self-respect. That's harder." Over the next 2 years, I watched my son slowly rebuild his reputation, both within the company and in my life. He started reporting to Patricia directly, no longer in a leadership role, but in a technical position where his coding skills were valued. He was good at his work. When he wasn't given power, when he wasn't corrupted by ambition and Vesper's influence, he was genuinely talented. More importantly, he started coming to Sunday dinners at my house. Just the two of us, cooking together, talking. We didn't pretend the betrayal hadn't happened. We talked about it directly. "Do you remember?" David said one evening while we were chopping vegetables. "When I was 7 and I broke your favorite vase?" I laughed despite myself. "Of course I do. You tried to hide the pieces in your toy box. I was so scared you'd be mad at me," he said. "But when you found out, instead of yelling, you hugged me. You told me that things can be replaced but your relationship with me couldn't be. You said that was all that mattered." "I remember," I said. "I think I've spent my entire life taking that too literally," David continued. "I thought it meant you'd always forgive me no matter what. I thought it meant I could do anything and you'd still love me. I didn't understand the difference between forgiveness and consequence. I didn't understand that you could love me and still hold me accountable." I set down my knife and looked at my son. "I was wrong to teach you that," I said. "Love isn't unconditional forgiveness. Love is honest. Love sometimes means saying no. Love sometimes means consequences." "I wish I'd learned that earlier," David said. "So do I replied. "But maybe it's better that you learned it now, while there was still time to become someone decent." By the 3rd year, something remarkable happened. TechFlow Solutions went public. The IPO valued the company at $250 million. My investment became worth $150 million. Not just the return of my $2 million, but exponential growth. I could have become bitter about it. I could have thought about how different things might have been if David and Vesper hadn't stolen from the company in the first place. If their corruption hadn't necessitated the restructuring that made the company attractive to serious investors. But I didn't. Because I'd learned something else through this experience. That money isn't the point. The point is dignity. The point is knowing who you are and what you won't compromise. I used my newfound wealth thoughtfully. I established the Chen Family Education Fund in honor of my parents, providing scholarships to first-generation college students from immigrant families. I donated significantly to organizations that support women in business. I retired completely and started teaching part-time at a local community college, helping young people understand financial literacy. And I created something I called the Integrity Initiative, a program that brought together young entrepreneurs and seasoned business professionals for mentorship. The curriculum focused specifically on ethical business practices and the long-term cost of corruption. David volunteered as a mentor. He spoke honestly about his mistakes to young founders, about how easy it is to convince yourself that theft is justified, that corruption is necessary, that dishonesty is just how business works. One evening, about 4 years after the board meeting, David and I were walking through the park near my house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Mom," he said, "I want to apologize again." "David," I said gently, "you've apologized many times. I've forgiven you. We're past that." "I know," he said, "but I don't think I'll ever truly be past it. I don't think I should be. What I did was unforgivable. The fact that you've chosen to forgive me is grace, not something I've earned." I took his arm as we walked. You're right. It is grace. But it's also something else. It's the fact that I still believe in you. I believe that you learned from this. I believe that you're someone worth knowing now. Am I? He asked. After all that? Yes, I said. But not because you're my son. Because of who you've chosen to become since then. That night, I sat down and wrote out the full story of what had happened. Not for anyone else, but for myself. I wrote down every detail, every emotion, every lesson. I wrote about the anger and the hurt. I wrote about the reconciliation and the rebuilding. I wrote about discovering that my $2 million investment wasn't really about money at all. It was about whether I loved my son more than I respected myself. And I discovered the answer. I loved him. But I respected myself more. And that wasn't selfish. That was survival. That was integrity. Years later, when people asked me about the experience, I'd tell them the truth. It was the most painful thing I've ever gone through. And it was also the most valuable. Because it taught me that you can love someone and still hold them accountable. You can forgive someone and still maintain boundaries. You can be kind and still be firm. You can be a mother without sacrificing your dignity. But the story doesn't end with David and me finding our footing. Families are more complex than that. They're ecosystems, and when one thing changes, everything ripples outward. David had been married to his wife, Jennifer, throughout this entire ordeal. She was a kind woman, thoughtful, but she'd largely stayed out of the business side of David's life. She was an interior designer, creative and intuitive, the kind of person who understood aesthetics, but had never been particularly interested in finance or corporate structure. When the scandal broke, Jennifer was devastated. Not because of the legal consequences or the financial impact, but because she didn't know. David had hidden this from her. For years, while she was building her own business, raising their 2 young children, David was committing fraud and not telling her. She found out from me, in a phone call where I had to explain to my daughter-in-law that her husband was a thief. Jennifer came to see me 2 weeks after the board meeting. She was pale, exhausted, her eyes red from crying. We sat in my living room, and she didn't even drink the tea I offered her. How did you know? She asked. How did you figure out what David was doing when I, his wife, had no idea? I'm an accountant, I said gently. I was trained to look for inconsistencies. But more than that, I had distance. You were too close to it. You were building a life with him, raising children with him. It's harder to see clearly when you're living inside the situation. I feel so stupid, Jennifer said, and she started to cry again. Don't, I said firmly. You're not stupid. You trusted your husband. That's not stupidity. That's faith. And the fact that he betrayed that faith says something about him, not about you. But how do I trust him again? She asked. How do I live with someone after something like this? This was a question I couldn't answer for her, though I understood its weight. Trust is the foundation of marriage in a way it isn't quite the same for parent-child relationships. A parent can love a child unconditionally even when they don't trust them completely. A marriage requires both. I think, I said carefully. You have to make your own decision about what you need. Some people would leave. Some people would stay and rebuild slowly. There's no wrong answer, as long as it's your answer, not one you think you're supposed to give. Jennifer stayed. I don't know if it was the best choice for her, but it was her choice to make. She got David into therapy, both individual therapy and couples therapy. She set boundaries that she'd never set before. She told him that he would be transparent about all finances, all business dealings, all significant decisions going forward. She told him that if she ever discovered he was hiding something again, she would leave. He agreed. What struck me most was watching Jennifer transform through this experience. She went from being a quiet partner in David's life to being someone who knew her own power. She started asking questions. She started reviewing documents. She started understanding finances because she refused to be blindsided again. In a strange way, the worst thing that happened to my family became the catalyst for Jennifer developing her own strength. She's one of the people I'm proudest of. Not because of who she was before, but because of who she chose to become after. But there was one more person this affected. David's younger sister, Amy. Amy was 28 at the time of the scandal. She was a social worker, dedicated to helping vulnerable families navigate the system. She'd always been proud of David. Proud that he was this brilliant tech entrepreneur. Proud of his success. Proud that her brother had made it big in a competitive industry. The scandal destroyed something in her. Not her relationship with David, exactly, but her belief system. She'd spent her career helping people navigate betrayal and broken trust. And here was her own brother committing fraud, lying to his own mother. Amy called me in tears 2 days after the board meeting. "How could he do this to you?" she demanded. "After everything you've done for him? After Mom and Dad sacrificed everything so he could have opportunities?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "But Amy, listen to me. His choices are his. They're not a reflection on you. You're not responsible for what he did." "But what if I am?" she said. "What if I should have seen it? What if I could have stopped it?" "You couldn't have," I said. "And even if you could have, it wouldn't have been your responsibility." Amy didn't speak to David for almost a year. It was her way of processing the betrayal. Not just the crime itself, but the implications. She'd been raised to believe in certain values. Honesty, integrity, putting family first. Watching David violate those values so completely forced her to confront uncomfortable questions about how well she actually knew her family. Eventually, she came to see that her anger at David was actually anger at herself for idolizing him without knowing him. When she finally agreed to have coffee with him, she brought a letter she'd written. She didn't read it aloud. She just handed it to him and let him read it privately. David called me afterward. "Amy wrote some things," he said quietly. "Hard things. About how I'd hurt her too. About how she felt betrayed not just by what I did, but by who I revealed myself to be." "What did you say to her?" I asked. "I listened," David said. "I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain my motivations. I just listened and told her she was right. That I had hurt her. That I was sorry. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a start." Amy and David's relationship rebuilt slowly, differently than before. They became closer in some ways because they finally saw each other clearly. Not as the successful brother and the caring sister, but as two complex people trying to figure out how to be honest with each other. The most unexpected consequence of all this was the impact on my own understanding of family legacy. I started thinking about my parents and the sacrifices they'd made. My mother passed away when I was 45, my father when I was 52. They died believing they'd given their children, me, the greatest gift, opportunity. They never knew that their grandsons might waste that gift, might abuse the advantages they'd worked so hard to provide. Or maybe they did know, in some theoretical way. Maybe they understood that giving someone opportunity doesn't guarantee they'll use it wisely. What struck me, though, was this. I'd carried their legacy forward. I'd taken their sacrifice and turned it into discipline, into financial security, into the ability to eventually do meaningful work in the world. But I'd also passed something less healthy to David. The belief that sacrifice was currency, that loving someone meant accepting whatever they did to you, that boundaries were selfish. I had to break that cycle. I decided to talk to Amy about this. She understood family dynamics in a way that came from her professional training, but also from her heart. "I think I taught David that love meant infinite forgiveness," I told her. "I think I modeled a kind of maternal self-sacrifice that taught him he could take from me without consequence." "Did you?" Amy asked thoughtfully. "Or did he learn that from the culture we grew up in? From being raised by parents who equated love with sacrifice?" "Probably both," I said. "But I can only control my part." "Which is?" Amy prompted. "Making sure that anyone who comes after us understands that love and boundaries are not mutually exclusive. That sacrifice should be chosen, not expected. That saying no to someone you love is sometimes the most loving thing you can do." Amy smiled. "I think you're already doing that." And she was right. My children, my extended family, the young people I mentored, they were learning a different model. They were learning that integrity matters more than loyalty, that respect matters more than tradition, that honoring yourself is not the same as dishonoring your family. About 18 months after the board meeting, I received a phone call from a journalist named Michael Chen. He was working on a series about fraud in the tech startup industry and had heard about what happened at TechFlow Solutions. He wanted to interview me. My first instinct was to say no. I didn't want to be a public figure. I didn't want to relive this trauma for consumption by strangers. But Michael explained that the story wasn't really about sensationalism. It was about how fraud happens in supposedly innovative industries, about how young people convince themselves that ethical corners can be cut, about how family dynamics can enable or prevent these behaviors. It was framed as an investigation into systemic problems, not as a gotcha story about my son. I agreed to the interview. Michael spent 6 hours with me, asking detailed questions not just about what happened, but about why. We talked about Vesper's background, her patterns of manipulation, her ability to convince a bright young man that theft was justified. We talked about my own role in enabling it, my willingness to trust without verifying, my assumption that my son would be honest with me, my hesitation to assert my rights as majority shareholder. Do you blame yourself? Michael asked at one point. I considered the question carefully. I blame myself for not being more vigilant, I said. I blame myself for not trusting my instincts when something felt off. But I don't blame myself for trusting my son. That's not something I regret. I regret not following up when trust wasn't returned. The article ran 4 months later in a major business publication. It was titled The Cost of Trust: How a Mother's Life Savings Became a Lesson in Startup Fraud. It was respectful but unflinching. It quoted Vesper's own admission of guilt. It included interviews with the forensic accountant. It included David's statement, written by him personally, where he took full responsibility for his choices. What surprised me was the response. The article went viral. Business schools assigned it as a case study. Corporate boards cited it as an example of what can happen when governance structures fail. And most surprisingly, young entrepreneurs started reaching out to me directly, asking how to build ethical companies, how to resist pressure to cut corners, how to value integrity over growth. Vesper, meanwhile, was not happy about the publicity. She filed a lawsuit claiming defamation, but the case was dismissed because everything stated in the article was factually accurate, and she'd already admitted to the crimes in her guilty plea. Her attempt to control the narrative had failed. The public record of her theft was now a permanent part of her legacy. I have to admit, there was a satisfaction in that. Not a cruel satisfaction, exactly, but a sense of justice. She tried to humiliate me, to make me feel invisible and irrelevant. Instead, her crimes had been documented and exposed. There was no going back from that. David struggled with the publicity in a different way. Some people were sympathetic to his redemption story. Others thought he should have faced criminal consequences. There was debate in tech circles about whether his involvement in the fraud was as culpable as Vesper's, or whether he'd been manipulated by a more experienced criminal. David didn't try to argue for himself publicly. He let the record speak for itself. He continued to show up to work, to do his job well, to be a good citizen. He let his actions demonstrate what he'd learned rather than defending himself in interviews. 1 year after the article was published, David's company, under Patricia Wong's leadership, was named one of the best places to work in the tech industry. The review process specifically noted the company's commitment to ethical practices and transparency. It noted that this commitment had come from the ashes of a corruption scandal, and that the company had chosen to rebuild with integrity as the foundation rather than brushing the past aside. The irony, I think, is that David's downfall became the foundation for TechFlow's success. Because Patricia Wong had used the scandal as an opportunity to build something genuinely different. She'd created a culture where ethics wasn't lip service. It was embedded in every decision, every hire, every policy. David mentioned this to me during one of our Sunday dinners. Do you think, he asked, that the company would have been successful without the scandal? Without what I did? Probably not, I said honestly. You and Vesper were good at coding, but you weren't good at building teams. You weren't good at leadership. Patricia is. And she only got the chance because of what happened. So my crime was necessary for success, David said bitterly. No, I corrected him. Your crime was destructive. But Patricia took that destruction and built something better from it. That's not because of you. That's despite you. Never forget that distinction. He nodded, understanding. But there was something else I wanted him to know. David, I want you to understand something about consequences. You committed fraud. You should have gone to prison. By most legal standards, you deserved to. But you didn't. Why? Because the judge was lenient, he said. Because I cooperated. Because I was willing to negotiate, I interrupted gently. I was willing to push for civil restitution instead of criminal prosecution. I could have let them prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law. I didn't. He looked at me with sudden realization. You protected me, he said. I protected you. I confirmed. Not from facing consequences, but from the worst possible consequences. I did that because I still believed you were redeemable. I did that because you were my son and I was unwilling to see your life completely destroyed. Why did you do that? He asked. Because, I said, somewhere in all of this, I realized something. Love and accountability aren't mutually exclusive. I could hold you responsible and show you mercy. I could believe in consequences and believe in redemption. I could be furious with you and fight to give you a chance to become better. I don't deserve that, David said quietly. Probably not, I agreed. But that's what grace is. It's not something you deserve. It's something you receive despite not deserving it. And the only requirement is that you actually learn from it. That you become someone worth saving. He was quiet for a long moment. Am I, he asked, someone worth saving? I looked at my son, not the brilliant, arrogant young entrepreneur who'd stolen from his own mother, but the man he'd chosen to become after that. Humbled, thoughtful, committed to doing right by the people in his life. Yes, I said. You are. Not because of where you started, but because of where you've chosen to go. That night, after David left, I sat in my living room and reflected on everything that had changed. My relationship with my son. My understanding of forgiveness and accountability. My role in the world. I'd lost money and regained it. I'd lost trust and slowly rebuilt it. I'd lost the illusion that my sacrifices guaranteed loyalty, and I'd gained something more valuable. The understanding that I am enough just as I am, without needing to sacrifice myself for anyone's approval. 5 years after the board meeting, I was invited to speak at a business conference. The theme was ethics and innovation, and the organizers wanted me to be part of a panel discussing corporate fraud and its prevention. I was 68 years old at that point. I'd retired completely from consulting work. I was focused on my community college teaching and the Integrity Initiative. I wasn't looking for a platform or an audience. But I said yes. The conference was held in San Francisco, in a downtown hotel with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. I sat on stage with 3 other panelists, a former SEC investigator, a business ethics professor, and a woman who'd been defrauded by her business partner and had turned her experience into a consulting practice helping companies build fraud-resistant systems. When it came time for my segment, the moderator asked me a question that surprised me. Margaret, you had every opportunity to destroy your son. You had forensic evidence. You had the law on your side. You could have pressed charges that might have resulted in a prison sentence. Why didn't you? I looked out at the audience. Several hundred people, mostly young entrepreneurs and business students, a few corporate executives. Because, I said carefully, destroying him wouldn't have restored what was taken from me. And more importantly, it wouldn't have prevented this from happening again to someone else. I paused. What I realized is that punishment is easy. Accountability is hard. Punishment says, you did something wrong, so I'm going to make you suffer. Accountability says, you did something wrong, and now you're going to understand why it was wrong and commit to doing better. But how do you know he actually learned? The moderator pressed. How do you know he won't do this again? I don't. I said honestly. I can't guarantee that. But I can tell you what I observed. Genuine remorse, real change, consistent integrity over 5 years. That's not proof, but it's evidence. And at some point, you have to decide whether you're going to offer people the possibility of redemption, or whether you're going to permanently mark them as irredeemable. A young woman in the audience raised her hand during the Q&A portion. I'm thinking about starting a company, she said. And I'm terrified of ending up like your son. I'm terrified that I'll convince myself that cutting corners is justified. How do you avoid that? I smiled because it was such an honest question. You build relationships with people who will tell you the truth, I said. You actively seek out people who disagree with you. You create structures where no single person has unchecked power. And most importantly, you remember that the person you're most likely to deceive is yourself. We're all capable of justifying anything if we try hard enough. The question is whether you're willing to have that rationalization challenged. After the panel, a woman approached me. She was in her 50s, professionally dressed, and she looked nervous. Margaret, she said. I'm Patricia Hong. I'm the CFO of a mid-sized tech company, and I wanted to tell you something. Of course, I said. Last year, I discovered that our CEO was embezzling. Similar situation to what happened with your son. Falsified expense reports, shell companies, the works. I had the evidence. I could have gone to the board and destroyed him. Instead, I did what you did. I called a meeting. I presented the evidence. I gave him the option of stepping down quietly and facing legal consequences, or facing public prosecution. What did he choose? I asked. He stepped down, Patricia said. He's paying restitution. He's in therapy. And honestly, I think he's learning something. But everyone told me I was crazy. They said I was soft, that I was letting him off easy, that I should have pressed charges. What do you think? I asked. I think, Patricia said slowly, that I prevented a tragedy without creating a new one. I think I upheld accountability without requiring destruction. And I think that's what the world needs more of. I gave Patricia my contact information and told her I'd love to hear how things developed. She became one of my closest collaborators in the years that followed. Together, we developed curriculum for the Integrity Initiative specifically focused on how companies and organizations can handle fraud in ways that preserve both accountability and possibility for redemption. But perhaps the most meaningful consequence of my story came about 18 months later, when I received a letter. It was from a young man I didn't know. His name was Marcus Williams. He wrote, "Dear Margaret, I'm writing to you because I read the article about what happened with your son, and I realized I was on the same path. I'm 26 years old, and I work for a startup that's doing really well. Last year, I started cooking the books. Nothing huge at first, just small things to make our numbers look better to investors. But it escalated. By this year, I'd embezzled about $140,000. No one knew. I was so careful. But then I read your story, and something shifted in me. I realized that I was exactly like your son. I convinced myself that what I was doing was necessary, that it was justified by the pressure I was under, that it would all work out in the end. I turned myself in. I confessed to my company. I've paid back the money from my personal savings and taken out a loan for the rest. I'm facing legal charges, but I wanted you to know that your willingness to expose your son's crime, not to destroy him, but to hold him accountable, stopped me from going further down that path. Thank you for being brave enough to tell your story. Sincerely, Marcus Williams." The first read that letter 3 times, and I cried each time. Not sad tears, but tears of understanding, of knowing that by choosing accountability over protection, I'd created ripples that extended far beyond my own family. I wrote Marcus back. I told him that I was proud of him for turning himself in. I told him that what he was facing would be difficult, but that accountability now would serve him far better than continuing down the path of deception. I told him that people were capable of change if they were willing to do the hard work of facing themselves. 2 years later, Marcus came to speak at one of my Integrity Initiative workshops. He'd served 8 months in federal prison. He'd paid back his entire debt. He was working as a junior analyst at an accounting firm, starting over in every sense. He stood in front of 30 young entrepreneurs and business students and told his story. He was honest about his motivations, the pressure, the desire to impress investors, the fantasy that he could fix it all later. He was honest about the consequences, the shame, the prison time, the damage to his professional reputation. And then he said something that stuck with me. "I'm grateful for my consequences," he said. "I know that sounds strange, but if I hadn't been caught, if I hadn't faced what I did, I would have continued down that path. I would have become someone I didn't recognize. The consequence, the accountability, actually saved me." After his presentation, several students came up to him with questions. They wanted to know how to resist pressure, how to say no, how to maintain integrity when everyone around you seems willing to compromise it. Marcus looked at them seriously and said, "You have to decide what you're willing to live with. Not in the moment when you're being pressured, but right now in this room, you have to decide. What kind of person do you want to be? And then you have to choose that person over and over every single day." Watching that moment, I realized something profound. The worst thing that ever happened to me, losing my life savings to my son's betrayal, had become a catalyst for something good. Not just in my life, but in the lives of countless strangers. Not because I was special, not because I had some unique wisdom, but because I was willing to speak the truth about what had happened. Because I was willing to model that accountability doesn't mean destruction. Because I was willing to show that love and consequences can coexist. 7 years after the board meeting, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I received a phone call from David. He was calling from his office at TechFlow Solutions. "Mom," he said, "I need to talk to you about something. Can I come over tonight?" There was something in his voice that made me pause. Not fear exactly, but a kind of gravity that I'd learned to recognize over the years. "Of course," I said. "Come for dinner. I'll make your favorite." When David arrived that evening, he looked different. He was wearing a new watch, not ostentatiously expensive, just a nice simple watch. His hair had started to gray at the temples. He was 39 years old, and finally looked like a man rather than a boy. We sat down to eat. I'd made his favorite, a simple braised chicken with vegetables, and we made small talk. How was work? How was Jennifer? How were the kids? But I could tell he was building up to something. Finally, over dessert, he said it. "I've been offered the opportunity to rejoin TechFlow's leadership," he said. "Not as CEO or anything like that, but as Vice President of Engineering. Patricia thinks I'm ready. She thinks I've learned enough to have real authority again." I set down my fork. "What do you think?" I asked carefully. "I'm terrified," David said honestly. "I'm terrified that if I have power again, I'll make the same mistakes. I'm terrified that I'll be tempted to cut corners, to rationalize decisions, to convince myself that the ends justify the means." "Those are good fears," I said. "Fear is what keeps us honest." "But what if I fail?" he asked. "What if I get power again and become exactly who I was before?" I looked at my son across the table, and I saw genuine humility. I saw someone who understood that power is dangerous, that success can corrupt, that the version of himself he'd been was not inevitable. It was a choice he'd made, and he could make different choices going forward. "Then you fail," I said. "And you face the consequences of that failure, just like you did before." "But David, I've watched you for 7 years. I've watched you show up every day and do your work with integrity. I've watched you treat people with respect. I've watched you make decisions based on values rather than profit." I paused. "I think you're ready. Not because you're perfect, but because you're humble enough to know that you could fail, and you're committed enough to try not to." David was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to talk to the board about what happened. Formally, publicly. I want to be transparent about my history of fraud. I want everyone who works with me to know exactly who I am and what I've done." "Why?" I asked. "Because I don't want to hide anymore," he said. "Because secrets are what killed me last time. And because if I'm going to lead, I need to lead with honesty. I need the people who work for me to know that I understand what it means to be tempted, to fall, and to rebuild." I felt something shift in me. Pride maybe, or recognition that my son had truly learned something profound. "That's wise," I said. "That's very wise." David took the role as Vice President of Engineering. He was transparent with the entire company about his history. In the announcement email to staff, he wrote, "I want to be direct with all of you about who I am and what I've done. 7 years ago, I was involved in embezzling company funds. I was caught, held accountable, and faced serious legal and personal consequences. That experience taught me more than any success ever could have. If you Google my name, you will find articles about this. You should read them. You should know that the person you're working with has a history of poor judgment and dishonesty. I'm not proud of that history, But I'm also not going to hide from it. What I am proud of is that I've spent the last 7 years working to become someone who deserves the trust you might offer me. That's a trust one have to earn every single day. And if you ever see signs that I'm compromising integrity for profit, I'm asking you directly to call me on it. That accountability is not optional, it's essential. The response from the company was remarkable. Rather than losing trust, David gained respect. Because people understood that his transparency came from genuine change, not from marketing spin. Within a year of taking the leadership role, David implemented new governance structures at TechFlow. He created an ethics committee that reported directly to the board. He established policies where no single person had unilateral authority over large financial transactions. He created safe channels for employees to report concerns about ethical violations. These structures, born from his experience committing fraud, actually became a competitive advantage for the company. It attracted talented people who wanted to work for an organization that took ethics seriously. It gave clients confidence. It built a culture where people felt safe raising concerns rather than staying silent. Patricia Wong told me at one point, David's history of fraud might be the best credential he has. Because he understands from the inside how easy it is to rationalize dishonesty, and he's built structures to prevent that rationalization. But even with all this success, David remained cautious. He continued therapy. He continued to have regular conversations with me where he examined his motivations and his decisions. He didn't take his redemption for granted. One evening, about 6 months into his new role, David confessed something to me that I think was important. I had an opportunity recently, he said, to bend some rules. Nothing as bad as what I did before. Just a small thing, mischaracterizing an expense to make a department look more profitable. It would have helped my standing with the board. What did you do? I asked. I reported it, he said. I could have done it. I could have rationalized it. But I thought about what you've always told me, that the smallest compromises are the gateway to bigger ones. So I reported the opportunity to the CEO and explained why it was a bad idea. How did that go? I asked. Actually, it impressed her, David said. She appreciated that I was looking for ways to be more profitable, but that I was willing to report my own temptation rather than act on it. She said that kind of self-awareness is rare. It is rare, I agreed. But you've earned it. Through repetition, through choosing integrity over advantage, over and over. Mom, David said at the end of that conversation, I want you to know that I understand what you did for me, not just forgiving me, but holding me accountable in a way that forced me to actually change. I could have become bitter about the consequences. I could have blamed you. But instead, I learned that you loved me enough to not let me destroy myself. I did what I had to do, I said simply. I know, David said. And it saved my life. Not literally, but in every other way that matters. I would be someone completely different if you'd let me get away with it. That night, after David left, I sat in my living room and thought about the journey we'd taken. 7 years. 7 years of rebuilding, of learning, of slowly reconstructing trust. My investment in TechFlow had grown to be worth over $200 million by that point. I was genuinely wealthy. But the real wealth, I realized, wasn't in the money. It was in having my son back. Not the golden boy I'd created in my mind, but the real person he was underneath. Flawed, but committed to being better. Tempted, but choosing integrity. Human, and therefore capable of failure, but also capable of redemption. I'd learned that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's clarity. It's the ability to see someone fully, their capacity for harm and their capacity for change. And to respond with both accountability and grace. That, I think, is the lesson I'd want anyone listening to understand. We live in a time of absolute judgments. We cancel people, we condemn them, we mark them as irredeemable. And sometimes that's appropriate. Some people don't deserve another chance. Some people will exploit any grace offered to them. But some people are genuinely capable of change. And if we never offer them the opportunity to change, we don't just lose them. We lose the people they could have become. Now, I'm 70 years old. I'm still teaching at the community college, though I've reduced my schedule. I'm still running the Integrity Initiative, which has expanded to work with organizations across the country. And I'm still sitting down for Sunday dinners with my son, my daughter, and my extended family, but now we sit as equals who understand each other. TechFlow Solutions is thriving. David continues as Vice President of Engineering. Patricia Wong is still CEO. And together they've built something genuinely meaningful. The company has gone public, made real contributions to supply chain innovation, and become known throughout the industry not just for its technology, but for its commitment to ethical business practices. Vesper Grant served her 3-year sentence and was released 5 years ago. I'm not interested in tracking her life or what she's doing now. What matters to me is that she faced consequences for what she did, and that those consequences were public and unavoidable. Justice, in her case, was served. But let me tell you what I've realized in these 10 years since that board meeting. The story I've told you, about my son's betrayal, about my discovery of his fraud, about my decision to hold him accountable. This story is important. But it's important for reasons that go deeper than just the specifics of my family drama. It's important because it shows something that our culture desperately needs to see. That accountability and love are not opposites. That you can care deeply about someone and still require them to face consequences for their actions. That forgiveness doesn't mean pretending something didn't happen. That redemption is possible, but it requires genuine change, not just words of apology. My parents taught me to sacrifice for my family, and that was beautiful. But I taught my son something unintended. That he could take my sacrifice for granted. That my love was unconditional in a way that meant he didn't have to respect me. That family loyalty was more important than integrity. I had to unlearn that. And in the process of unlearning it, I taught my children something different. I taught them that love requires respect. That family bonds are strengthened by honesty, not weakened by it. That the most loving thing you can do for someone is sometimes to say no. I think about my father sometimes, working in that mechanic shop with his hands permanently stained with grease. I think about what he would have thought about his grandson trying to steal from his granddaughter. I think he would have been heartbroken. But I also think he would have been proud of how I handled it. Not protecting the family name at the cost of integrity, but protecting integrity at the cost of family comfort. That's a hard choice. But it's the only choice that makes sense to me now. If you're listening to this story and you're thinking about your own family situations, your own relationships where someone has hurt you, I want to offer you something. The possibility that accountability and redemption can coexist. Not always. Not in every situation. Some people won't change. Some people will exploit any grace you offer them. You have to be wise about who deserves another chance. These stories matter. They matter because they're real, and they're about all of us. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe. Let's build a community together where we can talk honestly about the hard things, the betrayals, the forgiveness, the redemption. Subscribe and let's continue this conversation. But if you see genuine remorse, if you see real effort to change, if you see someone wrestling with who they are and working hard to become someone better, then perhaps, just perhaps, offering them that chance is the most powerful thing you can do. And if you're the one who has done wrong, if you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in my son's position, then I want you to know, it's not too late. Accountability is terrifying.